Fighter Destiny 2, released in 2000 for the Nintendo 64 courtesy of South Peak Interactive, Imagineer, Genki, and the Opus Corporation, still a mouthful, is the sequel to Fighters Destiny. No, I don't know why there's no S in the sequel, but regardless. Fighters Destiny was touted by critics as one of the better fighters to grace the N64, and there's certainly enough merit to that claim, and apparently it must have done well enough because it's one of, if not the only fighter on the Nintendo 64 to get a sequel. Fighter Destiny 2, and listen, if I slip and add an S to that title, I don't give a shit, just roll with it. Anyway, Fighter Destiny 2 boasts a roster of 11 playable characters with 5 more unlocked through various means and conditions. Your roster comprises a number of returning characters from the first game, a couple of which have garnered new names for some reason, as well as a selection of all new characters to play with. Modes are the same as before, versus computer being your typical arcade mode, versus player being your typical versus mode, practice mode being pretty self-explanatory, and you also have the record-breaking mode of the previous game with its trio of survival modes that if you perform well enough, nets you a hidden player. The only new mode to grace Fighter Destiny 2 is the Fighter's Arena, which replaces the previous game's roulette-inspired Master Challenge with that of a Mario Party-esque format. Basically, you spin the wheel, make the deal, move the number of spaces to a spot, and eventually win matches to build up your skill set. It's a much more involved campaign compared to the previous Master Challenge, and one that'll take you a while to complete, but whether it holds your interest for the long haul is another story entirely. Anyway, the gameplay of Fighter Destiny 2 is the same as its predecessor, 3D one-on-one fighting game where matches are won not by winning the most rounds, but by scoring a set number of points, and points earned depend on how you incapacitate your opponent, whether it be knockout, ring out, throwdown, and other means. This points-based format made Fighter's Destiny stand out, and I was happy to see it retained in Fighter Destiny 2, along with the ability to customize the point systems as much as desired. The fighting engine is also on par with the previous game, typical 3D fighting game stuff, with a nice little grapple mechanic for throws and such, since throwing your opponent is a way to win points. Controls are also relatively unchanged from the previous game, only uses 2 buttons, but more can be mapped for other functions and shortcuts, and once more they're functional, responsive, and work well enough for the game presented before you, which is pretty much the same game as the previous title, save for a couple additional fighters, and a somewhat lesser quality in the presentation. In general, Fighter's Destiny 2 sports some average-looking visual fare in terms of its graphics, though there are a couple minor improvements. Some arenas, for example, has you fighting on actual platforms and not just really tall giant textured cubes, though don't you fret, cubes are still a dominant ring choice in the world of Fighter Destiny 2. And the backdrops for some of these areas at least are a little more well defined, but still retain somewhat of a blurry quality. The character models appear a little more rounded and less disjointed, though still not the greatest looking things, and the actual design of these characters still feels somewhat derivative and such. On the flip side of things, you still have some kick-ass music to beat your drum to, with a couple tracks recycled from the previous game for good measure. Sound effects are fairly solid, there's even a fair share of voice bites found here or there, so it's not all bad. That's all there really is to say about it though. And that about sums up Fighter Destiny 2. It's just a slightly beefed up Fighter's Destiny with a couple new faces, a couple tweaks here and there, and a new single player mode to build up one of your fighters and use in other modes, but is otherwise the same game as before, and that's not necessarily a bad thing because the original Fighter's Destiny game was a pretty solid fighter in its own right, and number 2 follows along that path quite nicely. As such, if you liked the first game, you'll probably dig this one just as much, but if you didn't care for the original Fighter's Destiny, then Fighter Destiny 2 will do little to change your mind. In any event, a perfectly fine little fighting game on the Nintendo 64.